Hello, my name is Darius Staliūnas, and I'll be chairing this session. And I have a pleasure to introduce all the speakers. I'll do it one by one before they speak. And the first one who will have the floor today is Donatas Kupčiūnas, who is a research associate at the Center for Geopolitics, Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. He's also one of the organizers of this event. His research interests include modern international history, relations between East Central and Western Europe in the interwar period, cultural and intellectual history of diplomacy, geopolitics of the Baltic Sea region, and contemporary Russian foreign policy, quite many topics. He is the author of forthcoming book on the Vilnius question after World War I. So, Donatas, the floor is yours, and 20 minutes for your talk.
Thank you very much. Such a generous introduction. Great to be here. It's always good to come back to Vilnius. So my paper is essentially about what's Britain and France, the two most important powers in the post-war Versailles system, what did they want out of Memel? Before, it did not matter anymore what they wanted when Lithuanians took matters into their own hands in January 1923. Just for the sake of putting all this into context really quickly, why are we talking about Britain and France in the history of Memel? Well, the Memel region has been under Prussian or German jurisdiction since the 13th century, and by 1914, Memel was a somewhat stagnating little port of East Prussia with wood manufacture as its key industry. Germany did not care too much about the development of Memel, and in this respect, Memel had been in the shadow of Königsberg. Ethnically, Germans predominated in the city and bigger villages of the Memel district, while Lithuanians were scattered in rural areas, but they were pretty happy with the German rule, which ensured them greater prosperity than their compatriots enjoyed east of the German border. After the Great War, the Memel district became part of a punishment package against Germany, which was forced to cede the Memel district to the Allies under Article 99 of the Versailles Treaty. At the beginning of 1920, the French took over the temporary administration of the Memel district on behalf of the Allies. And so, in short, the Allies actually physically possessed Memel and ran the show in the post-war order in Europe more broadly, and that's why we talk about them here. As you can see from the title of my paper, I'll be talking about two kinds of British and French interests or motivations here. The first is what I call civilization, or imperialist instincts, if you will. The second is geopolitics, which means here promoting a territorial settlement with the aim of adjusting the balance of power in the area. And I have one more, which is not listed in the title, but which I will discuss anyway, and that is the interest in petty commerce or a modest economic gain out of Memel. Because especially if we talk Britain, and if there is any water in the picture, like the Baltic Sea, for instance, then you can almost assume that there is going to be some interests of trade involved. I'll start with a very uninspiring observation. Memel did not matter much for Britain or for France. The litmus test for the relative importance of Memel for both was the Lithuanian coup de force in January 1923. The direct British interest in the crisis which has arisen are nil, read the British Foreign Office memo immediately after the coup. We are entirely averse to risking any lives or incurring any considerable expenditure in bringing the Lithuanian adventure to an end, it concluded. The British even felt a bit of a schadenfreude watching how the French garrison was being kicked out of Memel by Lithuanian peasants. The French did not care too much for Memel region either, even though they administered it. It was a bit of a nuisance, which the French always got when putting their fingers into a German pie. Overall, Memel was more of a liability than an asset for them, and they were not too unhappy to escape from their commitment, despite saber rattling by the French minister in Warsaw. And then Lithuania, or even Poland, did not matter much for the Allies either, in their entirety. Yes, the French were trying to patch the hole in their security by toying with all sorts of little ententes, but all those schemes were a bit half-hearted, and there was no expectation really that they would be very effective in keeping Germany down. However, this is not to say that Britain and France were disinterested in the Memel question. And what follows will be an attempt to reconstruct the main pillars of their interest. So let's start with the geopolitical interests of Britain and France in the Memel question. And here we have to begin with the Allied reply to the German protest against severing the Memel region from the Reich. The Germans actually had a good case based on strong historical, cultural, and ethnographic arguments on why Memel was and should remain German. But the Allies replied, quote, "The district in question has always been Lithuanian. The majority of the population is Lithuanian in origin and in speech, and the fact that the city of Memel itself is in large part German is no justification for maintaining this whole district under German sovereignty, particularly in view of the fact that Memel is the only sea outlet for Lithuania. It has been decided that Memel and the adjoining district shall be transferred to the Allied and associated powers for the reason that the status of the Lithuanian territories is not yet settled." End of quote. Now, the paradox of this statement is that the Allied statesmen who were drafting this response were yet to see a live Lithuanian. And what they actually meant by Lithuania here was actually Russia. Russia was their former ally who sought Memel as a spoil of war, and Lithuania here was still thought of as some sort of autonomous state within a reconstituted non-Bolshevik Russia. It needs to be remembered that until the end of 1919, both Britain and France were still actively supporting the Russian whites in the Russian Civil War. And these were the Russians who did not want to hear anything about the succession of the three Baltic states. And so, in short, the crux of the British and French geopolitical interest in Memel in 1919 was catering for the interests of their Russian ally. However, by the end of 1920, the situation in the Baltic has changed. First, the whites were done for, and the Allies ended their half-hearted intervention in the Russian Civil War, beginning to realize that the Bolsheviks were there to stay. Second, the three Baltic states and Poland had showed remarkable viability. The Poles had their miracle near Warsaw in August 1920 and chased the Bolsheviks out. The four states, one by one, made peace with Soviet Russia. The British started trading with the Soviets, as they usually do with everyone. However, in October 1920, Pilsudski snatches Vilnius from the Lithuanians, and the Vilnius conflict begins. It is internationalized, and both Britain and France become its active mediators. And this brings us to the second aspect of Allied geopolitics in the Memel question. Britain and France were now using Memel as a bait or a lever against Lithuania, and were delaying the decision of the status of Memel in order to make the Lithuanians more tractable in the dispute settlement. At both the Foreign Office and Quai d'Orsay, the Lithuanians were being talked into considering some sort of association with Poland, which would give Lithuania both Vilnius and Memel. The French were particularly keen on getting the Poles access to Memel as an alternative or backup access to the sea. Poland had been the official ally of France since the beginning of 1921, and the latter tried to solve the problem of the fragile Polish access to Danzig by giving it a window elsewhere. The French policy thus advocated some kind of Polish-Lithuanian union, which would give Poland a second port in Memel. This solution was being pressed very firmly by the French Ministry of War and by Marshal Foch in particular. However, after the international settlement of the Vilnius dispute failed, and after the Poles annexed the Vilnius region in March 1922, using the Memel card as a bait vis-à-vis the Lithuanians became moot. And so the question of Memel resurfaced in mid-1922 again. While the French continued to cater for Polish interests in Memel, the British contemplated the eventual attribution of Memel to Lithuania. In the words of Wilton, the British representative in the Baltic states, Memel, quote, would put the heart into 3 million Lithuanians. Since Memel only bordered Prussia and Lithuania, the sole alternative could be a Freistaat on the lines of Danzig. But the Freistaat solution involved all sorts of complications, as the Allies already knew from their experience in Danzig, and just simply ceding Memel to Lithuania was a much more straightforward solution compared to all that hassle. This was also the option of the League of Nations, the opinion of the League of Nations functionaries, who had been dealing with the Vilnius dispute for years now. By giving Memel to the Lithuanians, they thought, the latter would be presented with a sort of psychological success that could be portrayed as a counterbalance for their abandonment of claims to Vilnius. The Conference of Ambassadors became the forum where the British and the French were discussing the Memel question throughout 1922. And finally, the decision was reached on the geopolitical destiny of Memel at the sitting of the 6th of January 1923. But in order to understand that decision, which we will discuss just in a moment, it is necessary to tackle the other two kinds of interests or motivations that influenced French and British policy on this matter. Trade. Already in 1920, the Poles have been plotting economic colonization of Memel. In the archives of MSZ, the Polish Foreign Ministry, one can find plans for that, which included purchasing land and businesses in Memel to make a sort of Placdarm for entrenching Polish influence in the port of Memel. The French, and increasingly the British, were fine with that. Gabriel Jean Pétisnier, the French commissioner of Memel, had been urging the Polish government to give a French consortium a linen monopoly and forest concessions in Grodno and Vilnius, and was promising to influence the position of the French government on the Memel question. The Poles, of course, could not offer much, as very little flax was produced in those regions. British commercial interests in Memel, while not great, have been a bit more substantial. Most of Memel's timber production was leaving for Britain, while a number of British firms received forest concessions in the Białowieża forest in Poland, to which Memel might have served as an outlet. And so in this respect, the Lithuanians were just bad for Allied business. First, the Lithuanians continued to insist that they would remain in a state of war with Poland until the Poles gave Vilnius back to them. As a consequence, the Lithuanians promised to block any sort of Polish traffic through Nemunas to Memel, including the sailing of timber from Poland. Second, from the outset of their independent political existence, the Lithuanians had been subjecting the district of Memel to every possible means of economic pressure, trying to demonstrate to the Memelander and to the allies what life in Memel would look like with a hostile Lithuania. Heavy duties were imposed on the exports of timber, crucial for Memel's sawmills and plywood factories. Imports from Memel likewise faced severe customs restrictions. Periodically, under all kinds of pretexts, the Lithuanians were sealing the border entirely, paralyzing all traffic. And so there is no wonder why the Allies were skeptical about transferring unreserved sovereignty over Memel to Lithuania. And this brings us to the last category of British and French interests or motivations in the Memel question. What was understood by the Western powers to be a civilized German town with its lit streets, buses, and railway network now faced the prospect of being ruled by what they saw as backward peasants from Lithuania. Stupid and backward as the Lithuanians are, I have long thought that they ought in the long run to get Memel, all the more if they lose Vilnius, but I wouldn't make it a short run, wrote Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary, in 1922. The French, who had an even lower opinion of Lithuanians and who were pressed by the Poles to secure them port facilities in Memel, advocated the Freistaat solution from the beginning. And so at the end of 1921, the British sent to Memel E.H. Carr, a junior British diplomat, to survey the situation on the ground. In his report, Carr concluded, quote, that Lithuania was at least 100 years behind Memel in civilization, and to attempt to incorporate one into the other would be simply a crime as well as a blunder. The French, wrote Carr, are as convinced as anyone of the hollowness of any Lithuanian claim to Memel based on the principle of self-determination. Basil Fry, the British consul in Danzig, agreed. Lithuanian possession of Memel, he reported, would bring Memel down to Lithuania's level. It was better, he advised the Foreign Office, for Lithuania to have a prosperous neighboring market and an example to learn from. Another visit to Memel, another visitor, the chief of the League of Nations Military Control Commission, Pierre Chardinier, noted that passing from Memel to Lithuania amounted to an abrupt crossing in time as well as in civilization. Chardinier tried to unpack the exact components of the civilizational difference. In Memel, he observed, there were no illiterate peasants, and small ownership had long been developed next to large ownership under the principles of modern agriculture. The Lithuanian side of the border, on the other hand, welcomed with an illiterate peasantry and with a land reform that risked to parcel every bigger estate. So you get a social question here as well. Such modern travel literature on Memel influenced political decisions. Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary, was knocked prostrate by Carr's report, which he thought, quote, proved to the general satisfaction that the Lithuanians were a savage and contemptible people and that the true destiny of Memel was German, end of quote. It was German, of course, not in the sense of belonging to Germany, but of letting the Memel Germans rule themselves in a Freistaat. So we can see here that the Allies in the Memel question had a very strong imperialist instinct. But imperialism was something that was legal at the time. The League of Nations Covenant, for instance, prescribed the mandate system where the advanced and civilized nations would administer, quote, peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, end of quote. While the mandate system did not apply to Europe, a similar imperialist logic was clearly at the back of the minds of the French and the British when dealing with the Memel question, where the Allies were looking after the interests of a superior German civilization despite its enemy status. Inferior and uncouth Lithuanians ruling the civilized and superior Germans was something quite repulsive and even abhorrent for both the French and the British to imagine. And consequently, at the end of 1922, the British came round to the French point of view and were in favor of making a free city out of Memel. A quid pro quo solution formerly thought to placate the Lithuanians for their loss of Vilnius and to increase their chances of successful statehood gave way to competing considerations of civilizational hierarchy and economic interest. And so the fate of Memel was to be decided at the Allied Conference of Ambassadors. On the 6th of January 1923, the expert committee of the Conference of Ambassadors presented its conclusions on the Memel question. Influenced by the committee's French chair, Laroche, the French report did not conceal its strong pro-Polish bias. While Poland did not even have a border with the Memel district, Poland's interests now assumed the paramount importance in the committee's conclusions. The original Allied proposition to leave Memel to Lithuania, read the report, actually had in mind the historical Lithuania, which was connected to Poland. Memel was not so much the only access to the sea for Lithuania, as it was, quote, a natural outlet to Poland's eastern territories. Culturally and commercially, read the report, Memel was generations ahead of Lithuania, and its absorption would bring Memel down to Lithuania's level. Moreover, Lithuania would not be able to deal with the local Germans, quote, inexperienced as she is in international affairs, entirely ignorant of maritime questions, which chiefly interest Memel, uncertain of her own political future, and hampered by the continual dispute with Poland as to her southern frontier. The report concluded by advising to make Memel a Freistaat under French High Commissioner appointed by the League of Nations. Such a solution, argued the report, would still keep Memel as a pawn against Lithuania in its conflict with Poland and would even facilitate the federation between Poland, Lithuania, and Memel. In the view of the committee, the Lithuanians would be unable to find the necessary capital to build an alternative seaport of their own in Palanga, which in turn would dissuade them from plotting Memel's blockade. The day after committee's conclusions had been drafted, however, the Quai d'Orsay received intelligence information that the Lithuanians were brewing a coup de force in Memel. I will finish with a morally ambiguous conclusion. Of course, what the Lithuanians did was they used force to further their foreign policy objectives. And this was precisely the scenario that the Versailles system and its baby, the League of Nations, tried to outlaw. On top of that, the Memelände did not really want Lithuanians to rule them, and their wishes and aspirations were ignored. But, on the other hand, as this paper has shown, what the British, the French, and their Conference of Ambassadors had in store for Lithuania in the decision of the 6th of January was based on outright imperialism, petty commerce, and just bad geopolitics. In the words of Pedro Soura, the League's rapporteur on the Lithuanian question, the Allies essentially were about to bless the Polish scheme of locking up Lithuania in a nutcracker, both in the ordinary and in the vulgar sense of this word. And the Lithuanian move on Memel in 1923 forestalled all that. This, however, came at the price of retaliation of the Conference of the Ambassadors 2 months later, when it officially recognized Polish eastern border and thereby legalized Polish possession of the Vilnius region. And so the Allied settlement, or lack of thereof, of both Vilnius and Memel questions had turned Lithuania into a revisionist power par excellence, which together with the Germans and the Soviets were looking forward to the dismantling of the Versailles system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donatas. So the next speaker is Joachim Tauber, who is the director of the Nordost-Institut in Lüneburg, Germany. He is an author of many books on modern history of Lithuania and Germany, His research interests include the German occupation policy in Eastern Europe during the First and the Second World Wars, the Holocaust in the Baltic states, and the Soviet Union and German-Lithuanian relations in the 20th century. So, Joachim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Darius, for introducing me. Today, I would like to look into the role that the Memel question played in German foreign policy in the international period. I have structured my material in chronological order, not very surprising, and based it around the three cities which will play a special role in the following paper: Versailles, Memel, or Klaipėda. Naturally, I'm using the term Memel in the interview period, in Berlin. I'm beginning with Versailles. Brendan already talked about Versailles. For me, it's the role of Versailles concluding Memel and German policy. My first initial hypothesis is that Memel was always connected with other foreign policy events and objectives. The connection with the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany in Article 99 ceded the area of East Prussia to the east of the river Memel, was one which came to have a particularly powerful impact. And it is Versailles that gives the name to the first section of my talk. The international peace settlement of 1919 was one which was initiated by and was based on concepts and plans of the victorious powers and was associated from the start with the German defeat in the First World War. From a foreign point of view, the Treaty of Versailles was perceived as a humiliation of Germany and as a national disgrace, with the result that, from the start, a central objective of German policy became a desire to see a revision of the terms of the treaty. All German policy, foreign policy, had to bow to this focus. This is Treaty of Versailles. This is one of the famous German politicians in the interwar period. Almost every one of you will know him, is Gustav Stresemann. He, as a foreign minister and as a prime minister, ended the Ruhrkampf in 1923, and he thought an understanding with the Western powers, highlighting the Treaty of Locarno in 1925, where Germany accepted the border terms in the West. But in no way there was any acceptance of the eastern borders. Even Stresemann never ever was prepared to discuss such a step, an eastern Locarno, with Poland and Lithuania. The German borders in the east thus remained open, which of course also affected the Biberland. German politicians were not prepared to make any irreversible concessions. A few examples. State Secretary in the Foreign Office, Schubert, did not mince his words when the Lithuanian envoy, Sitsikauskas, demanded certain securities against the German-Polish adjustment on the coast of Lithuania, stating, quote, there can be no doubt that one fine day the regions ceded to Poland will have returned to us, end of quote. At that moment, quote, the problem was not acute, end of quote. The envoy, he continued, must surely agree with him that it was thus not possible to say, quote, what would become of Memel at a later date, end of quote. State Secretary von Bülow commented to the Lithuanian envoy in August 19, 1930, I said I had long been surprised at Lithuanian political stance. A country with 2 million inhabitants, half the population of Berlin, that has only recently won and consolidated its freedom, seems to me to employing a very risky policy if it is at variance with all its neighbors. End of quote. Von Bülow's remark that Lithuania was at variance with all its neighbors points to a further connection between the Memel question and the Treaty of Versailles, and one which appeared to call for a certain restraint in Germany's behavior toward the Baltic country. A resurrected Poland, which had received a large part of the Eastern German territories, was the real beneficiary of German defeat. The anti-Polish attitude of the German Reich was shared by Lithuania, as the city of Vilnius, as you all know, and Vasilijus talked about this in 1920, went to Poland, and so we have the connecting point between the German political interest and the Lithuanian political interest. We talked about this, about the cordon sanitaire. I'm skipping the part with the Soviet Union and focusing once again the connection of the Memel question to Versailles was a long-standing continuity for German politicians and German politics. This German policy to keep the Memel question open was all the more simple as, from a German standpoint, the situation in Memel had taken a positive turn. This international development is the focus of the second part of my article, the Memel part. It may sound surprising, but remember what Donata said. It may sound surprising, but the truly threatening situation, as far as German intentions were concerned, ended when Lithuania gained control of Memel in 1923. You know the French taking part in the Free State idea, and the so-called Free State was absolutely unacceptable to Berlin. Why? Two reasons, two central reasons. All the Reich governments had from the beginning rejected the term of the Treaty of Versailles, both in their domestic and their foreign policies, as contravening the right of a people to self-determination, on the grounds that Germans were being forced against their will to live in a different body politic. The 1920 plebiscite in Masuria, in which a clear majority of the residents had committed to the German Reich, served as a proof for this argument. A situation now threatened in Memel, in which a majority German population voluntarily and of their own free will would not only approve and sanction the annexation of the region through the Treaty of Versailles, but also submit a free state to the French administration mandate. To this was added the strong Polish influence in the area, which would arise via France as Warsaw's most important ally. You talked about the Harbor Commission, the economic interests of Poland on Memel. All this was analyzed by the Germans. In short, a free state of Memeland would deal a blow to German politics and its objective to obtain a revision of the Treaty of Versailles. This would result in a political impact which would be felt far beyond the region itself. The Foreign Office in Berlin saw an alternative to this undesirable development as early as 1921. Quote, "The Reich government believes it should view the possibility of a Lithuanian annexation of the Memeland as the lesser evil. Should a free state under a French protectorate be established, it is undoubtedly to be expected that the future would be little different from a de facto Polish administration. Memel would become a vassal state, a French Gibraltar." As we are now aware, thanks largely to Lithuanian research in the 1990s, counters in Berlin were able, in secret interaction, to torpedo the Free State solution and ensure Lithuania came to possess the Memel region. First German analysis of the Lithuanian coup were thus predominantly positive. Quote, "All news indicates that the coup primarily constitutes a defensive action against the threatened formation of a free state, which the Lithuanian Memeland population justifiably considers would be nothing more than a French-Polish colony. End of quote. Already on January 18th, the German envoy in Kaunas also interpreted the Lithuanian action as a defensive step against Polish penetration of Memel and concluded, quote, this tendency of the undertaking neither objectively contravenes German interests, nor does it constitute a subjective element of harm to us. And the sources Donatas quoted just shows that the German analysis and action with the Lithuanian was quite right out of their perspective. The German side had even more reason to be satisfied with the legal standing of the region within the Lithuanian state as a whole. You all know the Memel Statute. It constituted bilingualism, and it formated a special parliament, Seimelis Memelländischer Landtag, which was the legislative party for the Memel region. This was good for German policy. But one other point is more than important and is critical for future development and for the German assessment of the Memel question. The German-oriented parties consistently achieved sizable majorities in the election of the Memeland Landtag, with the result that Lithuanian Memel policy repeatedly encountered the limits of the Memel Statute and the legislative competence of the Memeland Landtag. The Foreign Office, with its general consulate in Memel, sat virtually at the same table as the Memeland government and ensured that the legislation on a lower and intermediate level, e.g. veterinary services, bar associations, etc., was closer to Prussian than to Lithuanian practice. Therefore, from the German point of view, the situation in Memel was not thought of as a hotspot of foreign policy and politics. The German-oriented elections results and the coup carried out together with Lithuania in 1923 had ensured that the Germans had sway over the situation in Memel without themselves having to take any major action. The Foreign Office saw itself as the Lord Privy Seal of the Memel Statute and regularly insisted on compliance with the regulations pertaining to the German-speaking population. In summary, the internal situation in Memel was such that German dominance was guaranteed even without any major policy maneuvers. Now I'm coming from Memel to the last of the cities, Berlin. The policy towards Lithuania was characterized by the anti-Polish stance of the 1920s. Let us recall once more the words of the long-standing German envoy in Kaunas, Erich Zechlin, who succinctly summarized the fundamental consensus between Kaunas and Berlin. Quote, the antagonism between Lithuania and Poland was from the start the most important basis for relation between Germany and Lithuania. This corresponds to the logic of the facts. Both Germany and Lithuania have similar territorial claims on Poland. Germany's claim that the corridor be returned and Lithuania's claim that Vilnius be returned thus formed the given basis for a common policy with anti-Polish objectives. The Memel question, as already described, was thus dependent on German-Polish relations, which in turn had always influenced German-Lithuanian relations as a whole. Shortly after Zechlin's assessment, and under Hitler's leadership, there was a spectacular realignment of Germany's Poland policy from that of the Weimar Republic. On January 26, 1934, a mutual declaration between Germany and Poland was published, in which both countries pledged to resolve their disputes peacefully. Although Berlin did not actually recognize any borders, the declaration was a clear indication of a foreign policy which did not have a revision of the Treaty of Versailles as its sole aim. And secondly, the declaration always reflected the Führer's anti-Soviet focus, which up until 1938 viewed Poland rather as a junior partner in the advance towards the East than as the first victim of any conquest plans. These developments diminished the significance of Lithuania, as can be seen in the tensions around the Neumann-Sass trial between 1934 and 1936. This was not only due to the policy towards Poland, but also to the German-Soviet Ice Age. From this perspective, too, German interest in Kaunas as a link between Moscow and Berlin diminished, revealing more clearly the differences in opinion regarding Memel. During the crisis with Poland in March 1938, a threatening situation for Lithuania, the Germans were involved in double dealing. The situation presented German politics with opportunities for a new approach, and they made immediate use of this chance. The Polish-Lithuanian controversy over the Vilnius region meant that the two states had no diplomatic representatives. When a Polish soldier was shot on the demarcation line between Poland and Lithuania, Warsaw presented Kaunas with an ultimatum in an attempt to force a renewal of diplomatic relations. The German Reich was dismissive of Lithuania's pleas for German mediation. On the contrary, the new Foreign Minister Ribbentrop advised the Lithuanians that the Polish ultimatum should be unconditionally accepted. Germany had secretly received detailed information on the matter from Poland, and Ribbentrop immediately and secretly informed the Polish ambassador in Berlin of the decision not to mediate. The Polish Foreign Minister Beck, for his part, complied with the German request to inform them in advance in the case of an escalation of the conflict. After Lithuania had accepted the ultimatum, Beck personally thanked the German ambassador in Warsaw for the approach of the Reich government. The Third Reich had, incidentally, made preparations should a hot war ensue between Poland and Lithuania. The Wehrmacht was to immediately invade the Memeland, whereby the planned demarcation line would breach far into Lithuanian territory and thus beyond the actual confines of the Memeland. The weakening of Lithuania as a result of the Polish action and the growth of German power due to the annexation of Austria led to a new phase in German Memel policy. Germany immediately increased the pressure on the Lithuanian government. On March 25, 1938, the Lithuanian envoy was given an 11-point list of complaints relating to Lithuanian actions in the Memel region. Not until this point had been addressed could one begin to consider an improvement of relations. The first point was the removal of martial law in the Memel region. The Lithuanian government attempted right up until the autumn of 1938 to obtain a border guarantee or a non-aggression pact in return for the acceptance of the terms of the list. The German side, however, was not prepared to give up its strong position, and after the Sudeten crisis, Kaunas no longer had any leeway. The state of war was ended throughout Lithuania on November 1st, 1938, and signals were sent to Berlin that Lithuania was not prepared to recognize the German, was now prepared to recognize the German interpretation of the Memel Statute, but also to grant the Memeland population more extensive rights, provided the formal sovereignty of Lithuania over the region were to remain. For Berlin, at this time, it was the regional NS leaders, rather than Lithuania, who were more likely to seize Memel and thus posed a greater threat. Nobody doubted that after the clear victory of the German National Socialist Einheitsliste, which was anticipated for the upcoming elections to the Memeland Landtag on December 11th, Neumann, the local Memeland NS leader, and his followers would expect incorporation into the Reich. German internal policy had already embraced the solution to the Memel question, but the question of timing remained open. Hitler himself decided not to use the December elections for the incorporation of the Memel region, but to buy time. Why? The Nazis in East Prussia and Memel were very disappointed. Hitler's motives for waiting, even if not for long, as we all know, highlight not only the subordinate function of the Memel region in German foreign policy, but also the position of Lithuania. The only decisive point was that action in Memel might drive Lithuania onto Poland's side, or that Warsaw would claim compensations which could be contrary to German interests, but which could not be refused on account of the current Polish-German negotiations. The German side further noted on the significance of Lithuania. Quote, as friendly, even compliant hinterland, Lithuania would be invaluable for East Prussia, not only on economic, but on military grounds, as it would once and forever prevent the threat of the region being surrounded by the clash of foreign powers. Poland and access to the Baltic would remain open for Germany. Before the region is incorporated into Germany, evidence seems to indicate that this should not occur before relations with Lithuania are so stable that the Lithuanian state territory becomes a noli me tangere, don't touch me, for any third parties. For this reason, if Memel was to be returned, certain concessions to Lithuania, such as a guarantee of existence, would be conceivable. And you all know the way of the story. The Polish-German talks failed, and Poland not became the junior partner of the Third Reich, but the first victim of the Third Reich. And in this moment, Hitler's grip to Memel was made in March 1939. Conclusion. The Memel question was clearly subordinate to other political questions and goals in German foreign policy. Even in terms of German-Lithuanian relations, the Vilnius question was of greater value since it served as a guarantee against a Polish-Lithuanian detente, and it stopped any political plans to widen up the cordon sanitaire to the Baltics. One might even exaggerate somewhat and say that the most important objective of German Memel policy in the interwar period was to keep Polish influence away from the region. This was evident both in the Lithuanian action to gain control of Memel in 1923 and in the German annexation in 1939. And it is here that we see the basic difference in the political objectives. What for Kaunas was a central issue of the country's own raison d'etat, and foreign policy was for Berlin no more than a small component in German East Central European politics and the recovery of political and military power, all of which was aimed at far more than sovereignty over the Memel region. Not least thanks to the Memel Statute and the election results in the Memeland Landtag, Berlin was always able to be sure of a solution to the Memel question in Germany's interest. The Memel question was thus always clearly subordinate to other German foreign policy objectives. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joachim. So the next speaker is Julien Gueslin, who currently works at Nanterre Paris University in France, and among his many research areas is also the history of the Baltic states in the 20th century and the French-Baltic relations.
The Memel question is an unexpected consequences of the Treaty of Versailles and not really intended to please the Lithuanian nationalism. An hasty and poorly considered decision with a small rectification of borders connected with the question of the borders of Eastern Prussia. It was a blinding desire to promote free transit through the internationalism of the Niemen River, like other major European rivers, and to create a strategic border along the Niemen River. There are no detailed memoranda or studies found in the French archives about Memel questions during the Treaty of Versailles, except some Lithuanian memorandum, 1 and 2, 3 British or American memorandum. It was only in the early 20s that the Allies became concerned of the responsibilities towards this almost forgotten territory that now required some kind of management. I was just quote what wrote James Edlam Morley in 1923. You can read, it was strange, because he said, I found fast no information about the reflection about the future of the Memel territory. There is no decision would be made during the Treaty of Versailles, we should have to do, but we didn't do. And despite its apparent lack of importance compared to other European crisis hotspots, the territory of Klaipėda unfortunately turned into a laboratory for Western attempts after the Great War to create a new Europe and more modestly to stabilize the Northern situation. That meant combining new ideas, right of the small nation, League of Nations, with older ideas, the concert of great powers. It also highlights the challenges that resulted from trying to reconcile the concern of a micro-region with the objectives of the powers. It also highlights powers' inability to regulate a statute that was painfully established with no prior thinking. It's interesting to see that first all the diplomatic tools were used with the Memel question. Treaty of Versailles, Conference of Ambassadors, Special Commission with Lithuanian or with delegation of the population of Memel, International Court of Justice, International Conference, TRESA, official or secret meeting between the powers. There is no lot of territorial issue where should be so managed. And it is also a marvelous history of the diplomatic language, of the diplomatical practice, because we have a urge of files, British or French, who thinkings about what words to use what words to use with the Lithuanian, not to humiliate Berlin or Paris. A lot of memorandum with legal experts, where almost each word about the statute or each word to use in the steps, official, verbal, just discussion with the Lithuanian. All these things is very interesting to see how the diplomatical practice there was an evolution in the diplomatical practice. So I will invite 3 or 4 periods, chronological periods. The first one we spoke a lot, so I will to do a little. Sorry. So, France developed very precise intelligence on the social and ethnic situation in Memel, of course with the French administration. It became obvious that defining a clear policy with multiple ethnic and social identities living on the territory would be anything but simple, and especially with the social-cultural gap between the Memel population and Lithuania, and that would be possible to rely on the support of Lithuanian officials for managing the territory. I will just quote this of the French diplomat Clinchamp, who are in the special commission who come to Memel just after the coup Memel, and said, the sudden and immediate passage from one civilization to another for the border between Memel and Lithuania. That is the true border between Europe and Asia. And this declaration was going to be repeat and repeat and repeat over and over in the German Nazi brochure, of course with racial thinkings. But it revised how little Westerners knew at the beginning and the distance for Lithuania realities. It all started with an unexpected and sudden emergence of the state Lithuania and its territorial claims for which nobody was prepared. French policy on Memel was even more puzzling. France was, or should be, a power who claims to be the defender of the right of the small nationalities and to lead a foreign policy against Germanism. But it was not the policy that Putin followed. Unfortunately, Lithuanians sometimes tended to equate Putin's thoughts with the policy that Paris wanted to follow. So there is three French policies. The policy from Putin, who was connected with the local realities. The policy from the Quai d'Orsay, Jules Laroche, who was connected with the alliance with Poland and the Eastern Territory. And the policy from Poincaré, who was connected with the geopolitical order and the problem of the alliance between Germany and Soviet Union. So it was also easy to imagine the incredulity or stupefaction caused in France when the Lithuanian press reported on the pan-Germanist policy pursued by France in Memel. It was a big stupefaction. And of course, the most important thing is the famous idea of the Memel Freistaat. It was a good example of this mixed-up situation. It was a mythos. It was rooted in the Lithuanian mind that France was for a Freistaat. Lithuanians believed that Paris pushed for that, but it was only the result of the Putin discussion with representatives of the establishment in Memel and of the Polish politicians. However, since the beginning, French policy had consistent objectives. Avoid, of course, a predominant German influence that might lead to the reintegration of the territory. So, it was the idea of the Freistaat was totally unacceptable in Paris too, because they didn't want to have a new Danzig. It was not possible, unacceptable for the Quai d'Orsay. He wrote a lot of times in the papers and said it to Putin. So it was, of course, a mistrust to have Lithuania, especially regarding its future ability to emancipate itself from Berlin's influence. And of course, Galvanowska's policy tried at first to change this perception and to rebalance Lithuanian politics. His success, because this led to Poincaré's decision against the British to support the de jure recognition of Lithuania in 1922. Unfortunately, around the same time, British policy also evolved and to approach Poland, and it was a mistake. Just like with Vilna, it was long misunderstood by the Lithuanian that there were certain tensions between the Poles and the French who were not ready for support, unconditional support for Eastern policy of Poland. The most important for France was the barrière de l'Est and the Western policy from Poland against Germany, not to support Polish adventure in the East was disturbing. Of course, they want to have a stabilization, but not to support the policy of Poland Eastern. The most important was a strong Poland, of course, against Germany. Despite his proximity to the Poles, Jules Laroche, the French diplomat following the Memel question, faced harsh criticism from the Polish representative for supporting the idea that even nominal Lithuanian sovereignty was a necessary condition for the French politic. So it was a stalemate at the end of 22, and there is no decision of the Commission, just some provisional lessons. They say, finally, perhaps we have to continue the French occupation and to wait 10 years before to see what happened with Lithuania. So the Lithuanian uprising, of course, sorry, just a problem with it was a form of humiliation for France, quickly forgotten because it was the rule. But we did not change the fundamentals of the issue. With Lithuanian sovereignty over the region now established, France and the Allies proceed with the statutes that provide extensive autonomy and solid guarantees to promote free transit and ensure Polish presence in Memel. So the main discussion before and after the coup was economically and the question of the Niemen, of the circulation, the direction of the port and the free zone, not the relation between the governor of Memel and the Landtag of Memel. Perhaps 5 minutes. They didn't discuss about this. And they recognized a little later it was a tragical mistake, but it was, of course, the problem later. So the statute was a fruit of weariness. They didn't want to have discussion about this question. But of course, a new era for French politics and distanciation from a very restrictive Polish alliance. France preferred not to alienate the Americans, the British above all, and to leverage its role as a signatory power to control the territory evolution and, most importantly, to limit German revisionism concerning the eastern border of the Reich. We could say that it was catastrophical, this Memel question. By example, for British and France and Lithuania, they established only normal diplomatical relation and exchange officially diplomatic representative only after the deposit of ratification instrument of the statute, so in the fall of 1925, so 4 years after Estonia or Latvia, by example. Bellicose Lithuanian speeches, incessant rumors of new coups, the inability to follow diplomatic protocols and negotiations had turned Lithuania in the middle of the 20s into the enfant terrible of Europe, regularly mentioned in the newspaper. So the recognition of the Polish eastern borders and therefore a Polish Vilnius was largely a consequence of a French initiative aimed at channeling Polish disappointment over Memel, but at the price of inflaming Lithuanian public opinion. My second period. From 1926 onwards, the situation, of course, undergoes significant changes, with Germany presence in the League of Nations, while the reconciliation to try to maintain a tactical agreement between Germany and Lithuania, and on the other hand, the disputes over Memel and Lithuania growing concern about German power make France a kind of counterbalance that Lithuania can leverage against Germany. And of course, in turn, France can attempt to use Lithuania in its favor. So there is a French dilemma with the first complaints from Memel at this time. Of course, for France, it was not possible to disregard what resembles petitions sent by minorities, especially when Germany is joining the League and seeking to exploit the struggle of these minorities. Faced with Lithuanian policy on the territory, it was important to emphasize the impartiality of the Council powers and highlight the significance of the League of the Nations in the new Europe they seek to build. But all the French visits made to Memel led to a similar observation. The cultural and socio-economic differences between the Memel region and the rest of Lithuania are too significant. Any aggressive Lithuanian policy was bound to fail, because Lithuania has little to offer the agricultural and urban population in terms of opportunities, consumption, and social profits. The same for the workers, the same for the Jewish population, the same for the trade. Gabriel Puot remarked pessimistically that it was a clash of civilization without solution. The gap wide between the nationalist Lithuanian regime and the territory that it was of course a struggle to maintain the parliamentary system by the statute, but this became an important element for Memel propaganda and complicate Lithuanian action. Many Western journalists, I told you an article, was sympathized with the demand of the Memel, because Memel was described as a parliamentary oasis into a dictator. Among French diplomats, criticism has prevailed against a poorly drafted and incomplete statute that was deemed unsuitable because it was designed by the Western accustomed to parliamentary systems. So there is a strong citation of Puot, a quotation, which says that both Germans and Lithuania and Memel were unfamiliar with the parliamentarian spirit, which in its British version, it was Puot who spoke, required fair play, or in its French version, a keen sense of compromise and nuance. How could the Lithuanian imagine a governor who does not govern in Memel, but only acts as an arbitrator? And how could the powers expect the bourgeois of the small Memel port to follow the intricate rules of the parliamentary games? So you see always this patronizing tone, but it's very interesting to see how was the perception at this time. And despite this consideration, of course, geopolitical interest remained predominant. According to the Quai d'Orsay, the friction in Memel prevented Lithuania from turning towards Germany as it had done with the Soviet Union. And when Lithuania tried to have a conciliatory policy or engage some negotiation with Poland, such in 1927, it was deemed preferable not to antagonize the Lithuanian with Memel and jeopardize any possibility of reconciliation. So France decided not to take the initiative alone about Memel. It would not be able for the Quai d'Orsay to improve its relation with Lithuania and would play into German diplomacy hands. Only a collective action was deemed possible. So there was a relatively quick understanding of the difficulties faced by the German government and army in maintaining a conciliatory Lithuanian policy against German right-wing parties and the public opinion in East Prussia. So similarly, it was observed that there were difficulties in harmonizing the action of the German minister in Kaunas and the German consulate in Memel, resulting in the existence of two German policy, and French diplomacy tried to play with that. So better regulate tension while recognizing the impossibility of reaching a sustainable solution that satisfies everyone. But, of course, it was not a success. But is it so problematic that is so? Asked a somewhat cynical diplomat, French cynical diplomat. As long, he said, as a stable balance is not found in Eastern Europe, the situation in Memel avoids total German dominance over Lithuania and a challenge to the Versailles Order. And who ultimately cares about the economic future of Memel, he asked. According to him, at the end of the 20s, not the German state, which prefers Königsberg, not Poland, which now trade through other channels, not Russia, which has nothing to export. And for him, Lithuania, at this time, prefer its national grievances over reopening commerce on the Niemen River. So this analysis, all these thinkings, will remain, of course, theoretical, because during each crisis of this time, the intervention of the signatory powers will be limited by the compromise reached between the German diplomacy and Lithuanian. So I go to my third period, the period between 1930 and 1933. Of course, for me, it's a transitional period, because French diplomacy notes the hesitation of Lithuania between exasperation with the predominance of Germanism. There is an article in Lietuvos Žinios referring to Memel as a distant colony, completely foreign to Lithuania in the customs. So it was very commented in Paris. The growing agitation in Germany, and of course with the instrumentalization of the Memel question in public debate. And of course, Zaonius' desire not to break away from the previous policy, so the connection with Germany. As a result, the events in Memel are increasingly perceived as the beginning of an autonomous campaign similar to attempts in other European regions. We note a lot of articles in the French press about this. And there is more and more a discreet sympathy in French circles towards the Lithuanians' attempts to resist among this and this resistance against the rise of fascism. Starting from 1932, the Havas News French agency began to reproduce dispatches for the Lithuanian agency ELTA on the events without comments, but it was quite rare before. This was noticed in Berlin to the extent that sometimes in the press it was said that French began to providing clandestine support for the Lithuanian action. And the French government must officially deny in Berlin that there was this connection. And it was interesting to see that the French diplomat René Ristelhuber, was a French representative, analyzed the Lithuanian criticism against Zaonius' policy at the beginning of the 30s as the birth, for him, of a real public Lithuanian opinion, quite unanimous and opposed to any new capitulation in the face of Germany. And this sympathy is fueled by the changing French perception on Lithuania, whose modernization and westernization are evident to the journalists and to the French, the increasing roles of young elites who have been educated in the West and are increasingly influential in the society and the state. A notable proportion of this elite, of course, was receptive to French culture. And similarly to what had happened in Estonia and Latvia in the 20s, there is Lithuanian efforts are being made to find alternatives to German cultural influence in shaping national identity. So a turn in Franco-Lithuanian relations is gradually taking place, characterized by a deepening cultural ties and a desire to get closer to France, seen as the last guarantor of certain order. French became, by example, the primary, of course, foreign language taught in Lithuania from the mid-30s, and this evolution is reflected in the appointment of French courses and lecturers at the Pedagogical Institute in Memel and in the Lithuanian high school. Increased Lithuanian efforts are made in Paris, and more information is shared with French representatives with a view to use a French card. But however, this development faces challenges as before due to France's determination to maintain its role as protective power. First, to avoid further undermining of the German government confidence in the League of Nations. Second, a rather complex French policy involving moderation and attempts to destabilize Lithuania while maintaining a firm stance and collaboration with the British in collective action when the Lithuania seemed to pursue a too harsh and assimilative policy. It was the problem of the ambiguity of the statute. To be an obstacle for the nationalist Lithuanian state to achieve its ideal of the completely Lithuanian Klaipėda, while simultaneously serving as a tool for involving the powers to curb French action. Perhaps there is the same ambiguity on the German side. The French and British, on the other part, had to work with the only imperfect tool available to them to regulate tension, as with the butcher affair. And it was interesting to see that France rejects the Lithuanian opinion after to try to say it was better to have a discreet arbitration rather than resorting to the permanent Court of International Justice. But when French saw the dissolution of the Landtag and was frustrated by the lack of Lithuanian response to his advice, France takes the initiative to bring the case before the permanent court. The judgment doesn't cause any disappointment on the French side because the most important objective for France was to prevent in the future any dissolution and to safeguard the democratic principle enshrined in the statute, but who still sincerely wish to defend at the time democratic principle in Memel. And I finish with that. The last years, the Décadence. It was the title of the master book from Jean-Baptiste Durosel about the French foreign policy in the 30s. And Memel is interesting about that, because this year represents the swan song of the role played by the powers in Memel. Of course, you know the reaction of the politic of the Lithuanian on Memel with the law on state security and the massive trial in Kaunas, because it was based for the French of the belief of the still weakness of Nazi Germany, but it was, of course, particularly influenced by the proposed Eastern Pact and the relation between France and the Soviet Union at this time. So you will see a lot of articles about Memel questions. It was the most important event at this time and the most important, perhaps, question after the Vilna question, where there is a lot of newspaper, a lot of books. Now, we'll try. Sorry. Okay, so books, of course, all of the article, geopolitical article. And the theory, of course, there is a change in French rhetoric was evident. Whereas many previously spoke of a small exotic territory and an enfant terrible in Europe, there is now talk, not without a certain admiration for Lithuania, of a small weak nation refusing to accommodate the Deutschtum and allow the Memel foot to fall into their hands as early as 1933. The Memel question is no longer seen as a a small sole issue, but someone who is linked to the situation of other territories, such as Austria, Saarland, Schleswig. So the focus is no longer on respecting freedoms or autonomy, but rather on combating Nazi subversion. French Minister Staliūnas remarks, given the new threat of Anschluss, how important is now an issue in Memel of textual interpretation. Interestingly, Lithuania, in contrast, seeks more and more information from France on how public order is maintained in Alsace, in Saarland, and all the activities of controlled Nazi organization in these territories. But also Nazi Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. It continued to hold the signatory powers uncountable, using propaganda tactics to undermine the action of Western democracies. They criticize the democracies for the opposition to Nazi policy on certain issues and their silence when a small state would have violated the right of the German population in Memel. Nonetheless, French diplomacy and a significant portion of public opinion aim to either appease Germany in hope of stabilize the situation or demonstrate a firm commitment to upholding the status quo in order to avoid providing any additional pretext for further challenges to territorial order. And it was, of course, an excellent learning ground for understanding French diplomacy, the nature of Hitler regime and this polycentric regime with the role of Wilhelm Frick in East Prussia. We spoke about the SS and all the problem to have a foreign policy with all this organization. And of course, the idea of Hitler not allowing the agitation on Memel reinforced the hesitation of French government of the policy to follow. If that policy, accommodation policy, gave some result until 1933, it was no longer possible in the face of Germany. As it was entire foreign policy, France was not able to choose a specific policy. The British policy was clearer, but also illusory. Make numerous diplomatic representation in Kaunas to ask Lithuania to respect the statute completely and to remove any pretext for Nazi action. But the main problem was not so much Memel, but the security now of Lithuania. The Lithuanian government said many times it was ready to make strong concession, but on one condition, to obtain guarantees or declaration from the powers and Germany concerning its borders. So, at the middle of the 30s, the main time was to gain time and to preserve appearance. On one end, to maintain Franco-English collaboration in the defense of the principle of the League of Nations, and the other, to preserve the dignity of the Lithuanian government by avoiding intervention to public intervention of the powers that would be too direct or humiliating for Lithuanian pride. From 1935 onwards, Lithuania was disappointing, as France was trying to get closer to the British and increasingly consider Lithuanian policy as a dead end. So, the sole aim of many now allied intervention was to make Lithuania give way little by little and to opt for a hypothetical modus vivendi between Memel and Lithuania. To conclude, I use this from Milan Kundera. We said a small state can disappear at any time and it knows it. And this sentence can perhaps also be applied to the population of a micro-region. And these anxieties can only vanish in a stable international framework that favors the coexistence of multiple local identities. I will say that this all that has been lacking during these years when moderation and pragmatism were rather rare commodities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker is, and now I know that I pronounced the name correctly, Vilma Bukaitė, who is a researcher at the National Museum of Lithuania. She has produced several monographs on prominent interwar Lithuanian political figures, and she also defended her PhD on Lithuanian-French relations in the interwar period. So, Vilma, please.
Hello, dear colleagues. I would like to read my presentation, France's interaction with Great Britain on the issue of Klaipėda on 1922, February 1923, between cooperation and competition. In an attempt to find itself a place on the French of Germany, Poland and Russia, Lithuania put a special emphasis on the restoration of its statehood, but was also trying hard to find its modern political and geopolitical identity. It sought to gain access to the Baltic Sea through Klaipėda, Germany's former northernmost port. It was back at the Paris Peace Conference that Lithuanians already had a strong awareness that the new map of Europe was being shaped through tensions and compromises with both the neighboring states and the victorious states of the World War I. As the signing of the Treaty of Versailles was approaching, Lithuanians read an observation expressed by French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau to German Foreign Minister Ulrich Brockdorff-Rantzau about the Lithuanian Klaipėda region as Lithuania's only access to the sea. The young state considered these statements as an important promise and was eagerly waiting for its fulfillment. The statements made by the French Tiger were also not forgotten by the Conference of Ambassadors, which was formed in Paris to enforce the Treaty of Versailles and assume administration of Klaipėda region. In fact, Faroe, Japan, and even Italy were less interested in the future prospects of this territory near the Baltic Sea, and therefore its future mostly depended on political will of France as its provisional administrator and Great Britain. Keeping a watchful eye on their waving relations, Lithuanian diplomats tried to solve the puzzle cube of Lithuania foreign policy. The decision of the political future of Klaipėda region intertwined with the questions of Lithuania's recognition, conflict with Poland over Vilnius region, and the internalization of the Nemunas River. At the turn between 1921 and 22, the Conference of Ambassadors had a clear awareness that the state of uncertainty with regard to Klaipėda region persisted for too long, especially considering that France was trying to recover after the war and the administration of Klaipėda region was no longer a proof of its political influence in the region, but rather a burden. The formation of the new cabinet of ministers in the middle of January 1922 already implied that certain changes were coming. Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Raymond Poincaré was hoping to consolidate partnership with the British government led by David Lloyd George. In February, a new government headed by Ernestas Galvanauskas took office in Kaunas. Its aim was to remove Lithuania from the international isolation caused by the unfortunate mediation of Belgian politician Paul Hymans in the conflict with Poland. As we look through the archival material of the French Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, we first of all wish to believe that throughout this period of the conference, that through this period the Conference of Ambassadors was unanimous and consistent on the Klaipėda question. However, if you compare individual documents and Lithuanian archival material, the unanimous standing actually reveals differences in motivations and nuances in positions which Lithuanian politicians try to reset upon the endeavor to incorporate Klaipėda region. In April, High Commissioner Gabriel Petinet received an instruction to limit with 8 administration officers and 25 instead of 310 deployed soldiers. Such reduction in financing could be considered also as a precursor of gradual withdrawal. But in fact, France's intention was not so much to transfer Klaipėda region to Lithuania, but to former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As the earlier plans of Lithuanian and Polish Federation were doomed to failure, the idea of the jointly used Klaipėda port did not change. In the spring and summer of 1922, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs consistently discussed the question of the future of Klaipėda region with their Polish colleagues in Paris and Warsaw, which was absolutely unacceptable to the Lithuanian government. Great Britain was inclined to hand over Klaipėda region to Lithuania alone by recognizing its independence de jure. It was already at the term between May and June that British diplomats reassured Lithuanian envoy Naruševičius that the recognition and the transfer of Klaipėda region would happen in the nearest future. In the middle of July, director of the Northern Europe Division at the Department of Overseas Trade, Nicholas Serge Rentians, confidentially assured Naruševičius that Klaipėda region would be ceded to Lithuania. In fact, the concern of Great Britain was to guarantee autonomous right to the residents of the region, and it was planning to place a reservation on the decision under which it retained the right to amend the decision in case Lithuania formed a federation with Poland or Russia. It should be said that British officers expected Lithuania's concessions on the internalization of the Nemunas River and hence the common use of the river with Lithuania's rival Poland. British businessmen saw Klaipėda port as an important hub of timber trade, as it's what was said before, and hoped to transport the timber purchased in Poland via Nemunas River. The concession was also in line with the French interest as it opened an opportunity for Poland to use the river for the transportation of goods and eventually weapons. In June, French diplomat Raymond Bruguière warned the Lithuanian delegate Oskaras Milašius that it was planned to separate the question of recognition from the Klaipėda question, the regulation of which would take 6 more months or even a year. However, the concession of the internalization of Nemunas River and the recognition wording proposed by the Conference of Ambassadors on 30 July did not bring the settlement of the Klaipėda question closer, but only broadened the divide. The victorious powers of World War I drew the future contours of the territory political future in the midst of the debate with Galvanauska's government over the terms and conditions of recognition. We may say that in the first half of 1922, the initiative for the solution of Klaipėda question was on the side of Great Britain. Lithuanian delegate Naruševičius was recklessly crossing the thresholds of the British Foreign Office and the offices of different political parties to gain support by also urging Galvanauskas to seize the concession imposed by the Brits with moderation. However, the acceptance of the internalization of the Nemunas River would have made an important political concession to Lithuania's enemy, which also presupposed a potential partnership on Klaipėda port. While Lithuanian diplomats were involved in the polemics with French and British colleagues, the considerations over Klaipėda's region political future in Paris were further taking an unfavorable course. With the support of High Commissioner Pétinet of the one part and of the Lithuanian government on the other part, a large group of influential residents of Klaipėda and the French defenders on their interest visited the conference of ambassadors from July to November. Poincaré government tended to support the aspirations of the majority of Klaipėda residents to create a Danzig type-free city-state under the protection of the League of Nations. From July until the end of November, the Conference of Ambassadors was visited by a vast array of people who did not only include the residents of Klaipėda, but also the French and Polish politicians, diplomats, and journalists. Together with Lithuanian diplomats, the position in favor of Lithuania was also shaped by the loyal residents of Klaipėda, French journalists Jean Pellissier, Henri de Chambon, and Olivier de Chegoyan. However, the alternative supported by Pétinet himself, namely the creation of the Free City State under the protection of France, was supported by the far more influential personalities, such as French parliament members Anatole de Monzy and Georges Géraud, who themselves paid a visit to Klaipėda region in the summer of 1922. Apparently, the British consul, the Free City of Danzig, Basil Humphrey Fry, who actively kept track of the dilemma of the political future of Klaipėda region, also informed the Foreign Office about this favorable attitude towards the application of an equivalent status on Klaipėda, as Donatas already mentioned. On 16 October, the Conference of Ambassadors founded a special commission for the study of Klaipėda question. It was chaired by the devoted proponent of stronger French and Polish relations, Deputy Director of the Political and Commercial Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jules Laroche, and alongside with Italian diplomat Giuseppe Omnis Delicati and Japanese Miyakoshi, a member of the British delegation of the Conference of Ambassadors, Orma Sargent was also involved in the commission, and he shared the same political ideas as Jules Laroche, as we may imagine. He also headed and presented the first draft decision on the Klaipėda question on 13 December. The document reflected the French and British visions which saw Klaipėda as the major port of the whole Nemunas basin, both in Lithuania and Poland, playing a crucial role in the export of the timber. The authors of the text anticipated the status of the Free City State as administered by the joint Lithuanian and Polish Port Commission and the French High Commissioner, and controlled by the League of the Nations for as many as 15 years. It was directed a little bit later, but Drew Sargent became the principal mouthpiece. The draft reflected the proposals which had already been repeated by Pétinet Laroche for a couple of years. By lifting the financial burden of the French shoulders, it nevertheless had to enable the French to keep the political influence in the region. Strengthen partnership with Poland, help regulating its conflict with Lithuania, and also materialize the business plans of the Brits. The Commission was planning to revise the published the document after the 6th January, on 10 January 1923. Its efforts were wide by the Klaipėda region's armed annexation to Lithuania. In the meeting of 16 January, the Commission was asked to discuss the current affairs, proposing the means for stabilizing the situation and postponing the question of the status for the future. While reading earlier French and Lithuanian political documents, we may only make assumptions on the position held by the leaders of French and British governments. We know that in April, on the way to Geneva conference, Galvanauskas had a meeting with Poincaré, who also met Polish Foreign Minister Konstantis Kirmont, and the latter had previously paid a visit to Lord Curzon. We know that French and British foreign policy leaders had at least several chances for tete-a-tete communication, but it was difficult for them to find a common ground even on much more relevant questions, such as their relations with Germany and war reparations. Meanwhile, in January and February 1923, we can find a number of documents with instructions intended to coordinate the actions of the Allies and the contacts with the Lithuanian government, which had been signed by Poincaré, meaning that if they were not drafted by him himself, but were at least published in his name and endorsed by him. Poincaré corresponded with ambassador in London Charles de Beaupoint de Saint-Nolaire and delegate in Kaunas Gabriel Padovani, continuously coordinating the stabilization of the situation in Klaipėda region. The so-called Klaipėda revolt, at least in the first months of 1923, brought the French and the British position close and together with regard to this coastal territory. French military officers and a part of parliament members proposed a military response, but the opposing diplomats were supported by British colleagues. In fact, the authorized representatives of French and British governments in Kaunas, Padovani and Consul Arthur Dilly, later Tudor Vaughan in Kaunas, would continuously until the middle of February and sometimes even several days in a row meet Galvanauskas, who was also in charge of Lithuanian Foreign Ministry from autumn. Their goal was more a moderate Lithuanian political position, helping to maintain the political authority of winners of the World War I and prevent the conflict from flaring up. It is likely that Klaipėda question was also addressed at the end of January in Paris while discussing the crisis that emerged in French-occupied German rural region. At the time, Poincaré met Lord Curzon, former Prime Minister, Arthur James Balfour, Secretary General of the League of Nations, Sir Drummond. Despite the atmosphere suspense, the allies were getting closer to the decision long awaited by the Lithuanian government, which was universally sought by the forthcoming recognition of Vilnius region as part of Poland. The question of Klaipėda region played a role in constructing post-World War Central and Eastern Europe. However, in 1922 and in the first months of 1923, it did not become a topic of an active debate between France and Great Britain. The aspirations of France to lessen its direct role in Klaipėda region met the interest of its ally and its competitor. The eventual discussions were also suppressed by a geographic distance separating the two states from Klaipėda region, a minor trade and geopolitical role of the port, the long-running search for the solution and the scale of potential solutions narrowed down by the Lithuanian-Polish conflict. The so-called Klaipėda revolt cut the previous Gordian knot of delays and concessions by transferring more responsibility for the future of this coastal region to Lithuania. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, there is not so much time left, but still I encourage you to use this opportunity and to ask questions. We had 4 papers that all dealt with great power politics, with the attitude of the influential players in the region. I think one is missing. I have in mind Russia in this context, but still we had French, German, British perspectives. There was some overlapping in the papers, which is good for discussion. So the floor is open. I see one hand, and I think everyone needs a mic. I see 3 hands, so you then. Okay. So Vasilijus, could you pass the mic at the very end?
Who was the first, Robert?
Yeah. And we collect questions because there's not so much time left. Okay?
Okay, so I'll be concise. This is to Donatas. Thank you for that super concise, very clear presentation. I have a question that's probably naive to you, but I just wondered, because you framed this very clearly as a sort of civilizational discourse about sort of peasant Lithuanians versus other more civilized cultures. I wondered whether there was, in Poland or Lithuania, any kind of explicit callback to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a kind of shared discourse. Was that present in Lithuanian discussion? Or was it simply seen as a kind of additional Polish imperialism a la Piłsudski, the kind of grand Poland, the Rzeczpospolita? So I'm just wondering, does that temper this kind of very sharp divide between sort of uncivilized Lithuania and other civilized cultures when actually Lithuania is part of, technically, a Polish-Lithuanian past?
No, we collect. Here. Yeah. And then Thomas.
Thank you very much for really interesting presentations. My question is actually also follows on from the civilizational issue. So both the French and the British have a low view, as it was all described, of Lithuania. But it seems that there is a nuance in the attitude towards Poland, which I think by this stage the British are quite anti-Polish, but the French don't seem to be. And I was wondering whether there were some views from the panel on France's view of Poland and whether that was just instrumental because they needed Poland for these geopolitical reasons, or did that emanate from some deeper understanding or sympathy for Poland?
Thomas, and please raise your hands. Okay, Klaus.
This is the question that would go to Donatas and to Joachim. And my question is really about these cultural perceptions. And I was really surprised to hear from Donatas' paper that it seemed that these British diplomats and the French diplomats, to a certain extent, they were totally unaffected by the ideas proposed by Wilson. Wilsonianism somehow did not exist, in their minds when they had these attitudes about East Europeans, including Lithuanians. So my question is, how do these imperial and civilizational stereotypes of the British and also of the Germans, if Joachim can answer that, change after the Lithuanian takeover of Memel? Are these stereotypes challenged suddenly by this sudden ability of Lithuanians to act? Do Lithuanians gain more agency? And how these stereotypes, in other words, are affected by this drastic turn of policy in January 1923.
Thank you. I think Julien touched upon this question, showing that the attitude in France changed during the interwar decades.
Yeah,
Klaus.
I have a quick comment because in all 4 papers there was a strong element of this normative way that great power politicians spoke about Lithuania, about the Memeland, about Eastern Europe more broadly, and I think that's an excellent object of study in its own right, especially because a lot of this is still very much alive today. If we see how a lot of people in the West speak about Ukrainians nowadays. And just one other remark, which relates to Donatas' conclusion about how to evaluate or how to assess the integration of the Klaipėda region into Lithuania. I just wanted to say that I really think it's commendable that the conference title frames this as annexation, and I imagine that quite a lot of thought went into the title of the conference. But at the same time, I think it became clear in all 4 papers that the way the great powers spoke about this in a very casual way about access to the sea. And I remember a quote myself from a British geographer, political geographer at that time, who said, "What good is a bottle of wine if it's corked up?" when he spoke about Polish access to the sea. So a very casual talk about how territory should be allocated. Then you can't really blame Lithuanian politicians for claiming that right too, for something that great powers were casually doing all the time throughout history. So in a sense, Lithuania behaved not very much like a small state at that time, but claimed for itself, in a sense, a right that that was usually reserved for great powers. So that's just a quick comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I also have one question, just short. We've heard from the presentation of Julien that there were 3 French policies in the early 1920s. My question goes to Joachim, whether there was only one German policy regarding the Memel territory in the early 1920s.
Okay, can we get Mike back? And of course, you're allowed to ask questions to each other if there is a need for that. Yeah, but yeah, you can go.
Yes, so let's start with the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth. The problem with that, and why the Lithuanians couldn't and wouldn't use that in sort of response to these old civilizational remarks, if you will, is that this was something at the basis of Lithuanian nationalism itself. The Lithuanians shrugged off this whole tradition in the end of 19th century by saying that, you know, the Poles have been dominant, they have exploited us, we don't want anything to do with this tradition. And this Commonwealth had a bit of a, you know, bad rep in the history and historiography in the West as well, because it failed. You know, it was an example of a failed state. And Lithuanians also thought that by disassociating from that, they could get points there as well. Now, as to Thomas' question about the Wilsonianism and whether the treatment and the way how the West saw Lithuania changed after the coup, I would go as far as to say that, you know, there was not much Wilsonianism in Wilson's thinking. Wilson didn't care about the Baltic states in particular. He was pretty happy to let them go back to Russia as long as it was white and, you know, non-Bolshevik. And there are all these comic, you know, scenes during the Versailles conference when the Lithuanians really tried to see this guy because it's Wilson, right? And you know, every single time they're told that Wilson doesn't have time for you guys, just and then they see Wilson coming with his wife to a horse race, you know. And, so because the Americans were really careful to, you know, not upset Russia. As to whether Western opinion changed, I wouldn't say so. I mean, if we open British cables in 1939 coming from Lithuania to London, they just mock. They're mocking all these Lithuanian political personalities. You know, Smetoninė. They make a caricature out of Smetoninė. You know, she's like a heavy drinker and playing cards and this sort of femme fatale. And I mean, I really wouldn't say that it changed, to be honest. And especially, you know, the whole farce when the Lithuanians get to Vilnius and then they become Russian as a result, you know. So Vilnius is ours and we're Russian. Also, yeah, this brought back all these stereotypes about the stupidity of the Lithuanians. They would use those, you know, terms.
Yeah, about stereotype changing, definitely no. Yeah, it's all the same story. I remember one memoirs of a German envoy who came to Lithuania around 1930. He came from South America, I guess Uruguay. And in his diary and memories, he's writing about his first acquaintance with Lithuania. And he went via Eidkulen, yeah, and as Julien told, and he wrote, now I'm feeling the east coming nearer and nearer with every kilometer going to Kaunas. Yeah, yeah. It's always there. There was no change with 1923. It was a power game by the Germans with the Lithuanians, the lesser evil. And then in Paris, there were talks about the situations. And the Memelander, the German people living in the Memel region, said, what is the German embassy in Paris doing? They are collaborating with the Lithuanians against our German brothers, yeah, are making the deals with the Lithuanians on our behalf. Second question, continuity. I would rather strongly suggest, yes, the Memel policy between Weimar and the Third Reich didn't change. There was more confrontation with the Führer's decision with Poland, but the whole setting was always the same. Keep first one fine day, we talk about Memel with the Lithuanians, normally in cooperation with getting our territories back from Poland. Second, we have a strong position in Memel. It's not necessary to do anything. We can always say you are against the Memel Statute. The war status in Memel is a clear goal for German policy. They always could say, this is no democracy. It's rather paradox that the democracy in the Memel Statute was guarded and shielded by Hitler's Third Reich. Yeah? And I skipped it out of my paper, very short. We have a pluralistic situation in the Third Reich. There are many institutions, Nazi institutions, who were intriguing into foreign policy. And the foreign ministry lost its leading competence as executing the foreign policy in almost every sphere of foreign policy. Remember Poland, the non-aggression treaty. The policy against Great Britain. But in Memel, it was always a foreign office game till the end with Ribbentrop. So I would say there is a clear continuity, no change in the foreign policy.
Speaking about Wilsonism, I think it often was, after World War I, it often was a theoretical maxima and maybe even some ideological tool used for the real politics. It was more a beautiful idea than a reality of Europe, after World War I. Speaking about the Lithuanian geopolitical ambitions based on the historical memory, I think we can find some geopolitical ambitions motivated by their historical experience. But at the moment of after World War I think the heads were turned not towards the Black Sea, but toward the Baltic Sea. And even with the beginning of World War I, there were many considerations about the future map of Russia. And Lithuanians were very active seeking for the Eastern Prussia, and at least the region of Klaipėda. So it was some idea that was generated even at the beginning of World War I.
The first question about Poland. There is a famous article of a French famous historian, Georges-Henri Soutou, who said the French-Polish alliance between 25 and 23, how to forget it. So this is the question. So of course there is a problem with this alliance in the 20s, the politic from Aristide Briand, from the League of Nations, the French-German reconciliation, and to search a fundamental agreement between the powers to create a new order. Of course there is a Eastern policy of Germany, but they want to have a stabilization and not to play a game of powers against powers. And Poland, of course, there is Pilsudski, the new regime, the dictator regime. So there is sort of a like of, okay, we keep some special relation with Poland, but we try to equate with the other problems. Second, for the stereotypes, for me, I saw that in the study of the press article, there is a fundamental changes in the 20s. For the Baltic state. This name of Baltic state, you know that in French we don't say Baltic state, we say Pays Baltes. This is not exactly the same. Pays Baltes is just the country eastern of the Baltic Sea, and we were created just after the First World War. And this concept was used in the 20s because, of course, at the beginning, it was said this is a puppet state, seasonal state, this is perhaps the new Sarajevo and all these things. 10 years after, I would try to traduce, there is some expression of French publicist Henri de Montfort who said, the Baltic, the Lithuania, they just tell us that they could walk, they do nothing, but they survive. And this is the most important things because we were convinced that it was impossible that they could live and to create some stabilization, some internal and external order. And therefore, this is this discovery of the evolution, and that more and more the Baltic, more Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania too, were connected with the Scandinavian countries. By example, he didn't say there is Northern Balkans, but there is Belgium of the North. That means that it could be some stabilization between the great power. Of course, Germany has not influences, Soviet had not influences, French had not other influences, but the most important that they exist and that there is not an hegemony of the great power. And it was very important with this stereotype. Unfortunately, with Lithuanian, it was at this time that it was the Memel question and this deterioration of the relation with Germany. But what is very surprising is the gap between the very negative German stereotype in the 30s, more and more harsh satrapic state, pigment state, all these things, and all the reflection in France and perhaps in Britain about this state, we become to understand a little the Lithuanian politic. But what is strange, I recognize, it's of course to compare the British discourse in Lithuania was very sympathy, and when we read in the archives the report, we sometimes are very harsh, right, and very critical, and it's some surprising because a lot of British diplomats seems to be the friends of Lithuania, and there's a lot of French reports about that to say, okay, the British have a strong influence, and when we wrote what the British wrote about this, is very ironical and very critical, that there is this force of the stereotypes. Perhaps you have to study it, perhaps the French has the same, but don't, of course, say that more because there is this sensation of a strong struggle against Germany and Nazi Germany and try to find a common battleground with this case.
Okay, I think it's time to thank all the speakers. We do not have more time for any questions, so thank you very much.